Hello again. It's week 102 of lockdown. Well, not quite that, but feels like a long time. I've been recording these podcasts inside on lockdown. I hope it's all going all right for you. This is Zestology. It's the podcast all about energy, vitality and motivation. It's a podcast about health and wellness, so particularly relevant when we're all worried about our health and also we're stuck inside for so much of the day. It's so important to be as healthy as possible. And anxiety and the way that we feel about this mentally and emotionally, this lockdown, this pandemic that is affecting everybody right across the world, is so important. And that is where today's guest's book is just perfect timing. I mean, she wouldn't have ever wished for it to coincide with the pandemic, but her book is called This Too Shall Pass. And it's a book of stories on how we can adapt and thrive during our most difficult times. Like right now, when we're stuck inside and we're allowed out once a day for exercise. Julia Samuels, great description of today's guest. Julia Samuel is the psychotherapist you wish you had on call. And now she's on Zestology. She's written this book that is extraordinarily well timed given everything we're going through. She's one of the UK's top psychotherapists. She's an MBE, and during the last 30 years she's worked first for the NHS and then in private practice. She specialises in the area of grief and loss, and we talk about that in today's podcast. And all things considered, she's just a brilliant guest because, truth is, this too shall pass. But it does seem like it's been going on for a long time. Here she is, Julia Samuel on Zestology. Well, we're recording. Julia, thank you very much for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Lovely to be on your podcast.
Well, it's what an opportune time to speak to you. And whilst I'm sure you wouldn't have wished the current world circumstances, it's incredible how relevant your new book is, isn't it?
I mean, it's crazy. Yes, I could obviously never have foreseen it and would never have wanted it. But it is this too shall pass is the one thing we want sort of tattooed on our forehead right now when we go crazy, not knowing what the future holds. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's a phrase I've heard many times. Perhaps we could start by kind of going into that phrase a bit and why you decided to call your book that. And then we'll talk more specifically about kind of circumstances at the moment and how we can apply it.
I mean, we use the title with my editor, Venetia Butterfield, because it covers lots of meanings. So when you're in intense pain, whether it's through a living loss, a change that you don't want, or a grief, bereavement, when it feels so dark and you don't have any light at the end of the tunnel, you can't see it. But hope is the alchemy that turns your life around. So knowing that this is never going to feel this bad every day, that this will change, doesn't diminish what you experience at the time, but it does also kind of give you hope for the future. But the other thing is that we also need to know that good things, this too shall pass. I mean, that sounds a bit brutal, but I think we have a sort of magical thinking about life that it's an upward trajectory, that once you get on the right staircase, you can just keep going up. And the truth is, as we all know from our own experience, that it's much more a thing of up and down and sort of snakes and ladders. And I think if we can recognize that fundamentally we don't have control, but what we can do is support ourselves through it. And part of that is recognizing what we don't control and that it all shall pass is a kind of key message of my book and the title.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, obviously, you are a grief counsellor, and when you say to people in the depths of the most kind of unimaginable grief, this too shall pass, I suppose it must be quite hard for them to cling on to sometimes.
Well, I would never say it like that. So often when someone comes through my door, one of the first things they say to me is, oh my goodness, please don't tell me I'm going to feel like this forever. When is it going to change?
Yeah.
And I my response is that it is incredibly painful. So you have to acknowledge the pain that they're in. You can't diminish it by saying, "Don't worry, you're going to get over it, mate."
Yes. Yeah, I wasn't suggesting you do that, but yeah.
But also that it is likely that over time it changes, the level of the intensity of the pain changes, and it takes longer than you want, or that you would choose. But the key, given that you're in this much pain now, is to find the support within yourself and from other people to support you through it. That you can't hit your head against this, you can't will your way around it, you can't Marie Kondo your feelings into tidy little drawers. You have to allow those feelings of pain and loss to run through your system so that your system adapts and change with this new reality. And that is as true of a living loss like COVID as it is a death.
Yes, yeah. I mean, do you think that the current situation is particularly hard for us because we're not particularly good at coping with change, and we're not particularly good at acknowledging that death is such an essential part of being human? It's almost a taboo in the way that we don't really talk about it much, and we don't think about it in a relation to ourselves.
I think you're absolutely right. I think death is a taboo. I mean, I think it is changing. But we have a kind of magical thinking, don't we, all of us, which is if I don't think about it, then it kind of isn't going to happen to me. It's going to happen to other people. But the thing with the coronavirus is that it puts us in touch with our mortality and the mortality of people we love more in our face than we probably ever have before. And we realize that fundamentally we don't have control over things that matter to us most, which is, birth and death and how people feel about us. And not having agency, not having control scares us, because when we had this full sense of our control by just looking at our phone and putting in things in our calendar and buying and traveling, and we kind of felt like I'm really in charge of my life. And now we kind of realize actually fundamentally we can influence it and we can shape it in some ways, but the big things we absolutely do not have control over.
Yeah, and that's why and that's why your work and your book is so relevant now, I suppose, isn't it? I mean, we've spent our whole lives reading books and hearing about the Second World War, and really this is probably the biggest global challenge since then, and all of a sudden we're in the midst of it with no kind of psychological preparation for how to deal with it.
No. And also we've read all the books like How to Rule Your World and How to Master Your This and How to Meet Your Ambition with, so that there haven't been as many, but I mean, there's been mine and of course lots of others about facing the fact that, that we're all going to die and that people we love are going to die. Yeah. And the fact that, life is change. That is the only thing that you can know for certain, that life is change. And, I was talking to a doctor this morning who's working on an intensive care unit, and he was saying, all of them find it very difficult, the lack of, information or certainty, but they can actually live with the fact that they know that is the fact that they don't know. They don't know what is gonna come tomorrow, but they can deal with today.
Okay, so they're actually dealing with it quite well.
They're dealing with it. I don't know if everybody is, but I think they are. I mean, doctor. I don't know if you want to include this. I don't know if you want to include that, but yeah, they have a remarkable attitude. Yeah.
What about fearing death on a personal level? I had a very wise therapist who's actually been on this podcast, and it specialised in emotional freedom therapy. And
I know what that is.
Yeah,
what is that?
It's tapping. It's another word for tapping, really.
Yes. I do tapping. Yeah.
It's fantastic and a brilliant way to kind of release emotions, and I definitely need it. I mean, my background is I trained as an NLP practitioner and then a master practitioner and a trainer. And it made me laugh when you were talking about kind of, we've all read the books about how to control our lives, because people often say that those who are drawn to NLP, to neuro-linguistic programming, like to control things quite a lot, which is probably the case for me as well. Not so good at letting go. But anyway,
I don't think I mean, I think one of the big messages of my book is none of us are good at it. None of us find it easy. I don't find it easy, and I blooming write books about it. So it's to recognize that this is difficult and it's discombobulating and it sort of does your head in, and you have no choice, and you can support yourself through it. Because what you do to avoid it and block it in the end does you more harm than supporting yourself through it.
How concerned are you by the emotional toll that this is taking on people?
I am actually very concerned. I mean, WHO issued a paper last week saying that they think the second pandemic is going to be a psychological one.
Yeah.
And what they said, which is what I also know, and is that the sooner you have an intervention for someone suffering psychologically, the better their outcomes. And, right now there's very little intervention that's going on. So I think there'll be a lot of, certainly people bereaved through COVID, who most of them will have had deaths where their family isn't present. They'll be very sudden and unexpected. It'll be a traumatic death. And I think the grief will be suspended until the lockdown lifts. So I think it'll be a very complex psychological landscape, of course, and all the losses from people's jobs and uncertainty, and there's layers and layers of it, and there isn't necessarily a hierarchy. I think for each person that they face, there's no one that's going untouched. Of course, it's much more difficult for some sections of society than others, but I think there is going to be a big knock-on effect, and I really hope that it is met and responded to effectively.
So in terms of your work, and this too shall pass, what are the kind of things that you would like to encourage us to do to protect ourselves emotionally? And obviously people listening to this are going through such a wide... Some people are quite enjoying the fact that, obviously despite the underlying anxiety about loved ones, they have more time to cook and more time to, if they have a garden, to sit outside and all that kind of thing. But many people aren't. So how are you encouraging people to deal with this pandemic?
I think, first of all, the kind of serenity prayer, to accept the things that you cannot change the things you can, and the wisdom to know the difference. That if you kind of go in a loop on your brain trying to will yourself to feel differently or do differently or know differently, you'll tie yourself in knots and make what's already a difficult experience much worse. So I think you need to support your emotions to kind of be expressed and go through your system. And that can be by journaling. So you can do it by writing it down. It can be by talking to a friend, and that can be online. It doesn't have to be face to face. But I think you have to find a way of expressing what's incoherent in your system, finding words and actually verbalizing it. Some people can find what they feel by other therapies like painting or writing poetry or even gardening, I think. But you need to kind of unlock your body's wisdom, which if it's feeling very anxious or very tense or very frightened or all of those things, you need to find a way of allowing it to run through you. Yeah. I think to keep today, not to project far into the future, like you can deal with today, like the consultant was saying, but also exercise. So grief feels like fear, and so does anxiety in your body. And it, as you know this, it heightens the cortisol, which puts your body on alert. So it sort of stays zinging. So exercise, a combination of exercise and a breathing exercise doing that afterwards is a very good balancing combination, which really lowers your levels of anxiety. And this doesn't mean you have to run a marathon or do anything fancy. Like, just get your heart rate up for 15, 20 minutes. Do a breathing exercise for 5 minutes. That is a very good way of thing to include every day.
Yeah. I mean, it's so noticeable at the moment after my daily walk how much better I feel. I'm sure everybody feels the same way about that. And it just occurred to me... Sorry, carry on.
Well, doing it outside, if you can go outside, if you're not in the high risk category, has added benefits. Being in nature and being in spring now, which is like magic coming alive, that does lift your spirits. it really does. So if you can do it outside, even better.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Just going back to the EFT, you talking about exercise and breathing and having a physical outlet for what's going on. I mean, that was the whole reason that I needed all that so badly. Is I spend so much time in my head, and then there was this really. I mean, the reason I went to this guy was not because he was a specialist in EFT, but he specialised in other things, including fatigue, which I was suffering with at the time, which is why I started this podcast about energy, just this kind of weird, mad, very physical act of tapping seemed to bring out so much emotion out of me. It's incredible. And all those other things that you mentioned, I think, also do the same thing, especially exercise.
It really does. And, we know, and from your experience, is that the body remembers, the body holds the score. So that there's the body's wisdom that you need to release, because otherwise it locks in. And as you describe, you have this incredible tightness. And so when I talk about supporting yourself through the process of change, if you block the pain, if you think of your emotional self as a kind of bandwidth, if you block emotional pain, whatever kind of pain it is, you incrementally also block your capacity to feel joy. So your capacity to feel is foreshortened. So you function fine, you breathe in and out, but you don't take any joy in life. So when you block and resist change, research shows you have less joy and less success in life, and change in the future will hit you harder.
Just interrupting this podcast for one moment to remind you that it is brought to you by my podcast partners today, P3OM, the amazing probiotic that, very excited to say, you can try for free. I mean, as you know, everyone's facing challenges at the moment. The recent virus pandemic is definitely increasing our stress, as we've been talking about in this podcast with Julia, but also the financials, the sickness, the quarantines, and just the general worry about our health. There's not a lot of people who haven't been touched by it. And one of the highest risk factors is a weakened immune system. So that is what we are focusing on Zestology in the month of May with P3OM. And you might have heard me talk about bioptimizers over the last month or two. I asked my friends there if they could help out during these tough times, and they have agreed to give away a free bottle of P3OM. This is their patented probiotic until the end of this month. I mean, I'm a real fan of P3OM. I've been talking about it quite a bit on this podcast. It's an excellent probiotic. There's a good reason I've been speaking about it so much, because it helps eliminate bad bacteria and rapidly boosts your gut health. And it's one of the strongest probiotics that you will ever find. So if you go to P3OM/Zestology free, that's P3OM/Zestology free, you will automatically get access to your free bottle of P3OM. Simple. And it's one per household. And also, it's not available in the UK, unfortunately. We're working on that, or they're working on that. But if you are in the UK, you can head to bioptimizers.co.uk and use the code Zestology for 10% off. Rest of you, get a free bottle of P3OM. Head to p3om.com/Zestology free. Now, back to the show. Wow.
How are you coping with COVID?
How am I coping? I mean, it's funny because I felt extremely anxious about everything about 4 weeks ago. And I've been doing all the things that I know work in terms of, reducing my cortisol levels and relaxing, and I've been eating really well, doing a lot more exercise than I normally do. It probably is helped by the fact that I'm almost certain that we've all had it in my family. So perhaps there's slightly less of a personal anxiety, although there's still anxiety about family members. But I'm doing all the things that I think work, so not too badly. And funnily enough, my partner was reading the paper the other day, and she said, have you seen this article? They reckon they might lift the lockdown sooner than expected. And there was a small part of my brain that thought, I hope they don't do it too soon. I mean, obviously, that's not, my main thinking. But what about you?
So I have swallowed my own medicine on the whole. I mean, it sounds like all of us need to up our own medicine, our self-care, because the levels of anxiety are greater. And then I get hit by great swoops of anxiety that just come rushing through me, really often by watching the news. So I limit that to about every other day now, because before I was doing it twice a day, and I basically can't cope with that.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's, but I do feel it. I definitely feel it.
Yeah.
Going outside really helps me.
The news thing is, I mean, obviously, my day job is I'm a journalist at Sky, so so there's no escaping it when I'm there. Although I am on the sports side, but all the news is coronavirus focused, even in sport at the moment. I think that is something that people find and I find really hard. I know that there's been, I mean, for instance, when Boris was taken into intensive care, and I know a lot of other people felt like this as well. I'm pretty sure I checked my phone in the middle of the night, and I know a lot of other people did. It's not healthy to do that, but I did.
Yeah, we were all upset, weren't we? Yeah. It was like, oh my God, all my clients were really upset.
Yeah,
and none of us.
Yeah, whatever your political persuasion, it was very shocking, because not everybody knows someone on a personal level that's been affected. I just wanted to go back to what we talked about and death. I want to go back to your tips in a second, but
yes.
the EFT practitioner that I was telling you about, he said to me something that I found very hard to. I do actually. He had an incredible effect on me, but he said something that even now I can't quite get my head around, which is that he doesn't fear death at all. He'd so come to terms with the uncertainty around it that he didn't fear it. Do you think that's an attainable goal for all of us? Because I think I do in some way.
I do. I mean, I really do think the things that we don't think about and we don't talk about scare us much more than the things that we really examine. And I think we should examine death and dying as much as we examine birth and life, in the sense that it is inevitable. And so that if we can have those conversations with our partners and even, our adult children, in my case, I think it's much less frightening, because you've discussed what you kind of don't want, what you think, what you believe. I don't believe I'm going to heaven or any after place, but I think I'll live on in the memories of people that I've loved and have loved me. And I've said that to my children. And so I think when you have those discussions, it takes a lot of the fear out of it. I think our imaginations are limitless and terrifying, but I actually think facing things gives us proper cognitive balance.
It's quite hard for us. I mean, quite a few people who listen to this podcast are Americans, but certainly for us Brits, it's quite hard for us to have those conversations and to really open up with anyone, really, isn't it?
I think it's super hard for the Americans as well. I don't think by any means just the stiff upper lip British. I think it's changing. It's changing the last 5 or 10 years. We've got death cafes now. We've got lots of young people going online talking about grief and bereavement. Social media has made it more accessible, more talked about. So I think there's a section of the population, funny enough, who my generation, sort of 60 to 75 or 80, who find it particularly difficult, because that was particularly their upbringing. But I mean, you're much more emotionally, as a man in the UK, you're much more emotionally aware than, say, your father, I guess. So it is a change. I think it is a generational thing.
It is, but I've still had to work on it.
Yeah. I'm saying nothing is for free, mate. You don't just wake up one morning and think, I'm sorted on the death front. I mean, that's why I call my book Grief Work.
I'm sorted on the death. And while we're about it, what are death cafes?
So death cafes are voluntary organisations which are all over the UK. You can just look it up, and they meet. They're organised by a local person who sets it up, and they meet, say, in Starbucks or in a little pub somewhere, and they talk about death.
Wow.
Yeah, they're very popular.
I bet. Yeah. And I mean, I suppose as well as the...
You sound shocked. I can hear it in your voice.
No, I suppose I was just thinking about going for a cup of coffee and chatting about about death, either with a stranger or with a friend or with a loved one, and it's just not something you really do that often. But
It's just so fascinating.
Yeah.
You'll get ideas that you didn't know that you could have.
Yeah. So as well as kind of exercising and breathing and keeping your plans fairly short term, that is something that we might want to think about doing as well. Obviously, we might not be going to a cafe at the moment, but doing that with people in however way you connect might be fairly worthwhile. Wow.
I think it's very worthwhile having important conversations with people that you love. Telling them that you love them, telling them that what you care about, and then talking to them about what you think about death and what you want for your death, whether you want to be cremated or buried, telling them where your passwords are. I've had more distress from people not being able to get into their family members' sort of laptops or phones. So practical things as well.
Yeah.
And to remember that, it's magical thinking. People think if I talk about this stuff, it'll hasten my death. And actually it does the reverse. I think the other big thing to support yourself is helping others. When we feel powerless and sort of have no control, if we reach out and support somebody else, it gives us a sense of agency and we feel better and they feel better. So it can be in a small way, like ringing someone who you know lives alone and just checking they're okay. It can be by being part of your neighborhood support for older people and vulnerable people. There are limitless ways of doing it, but it's incredibly powerful, and it has a bonus effect of actually being good for your immunity.
Yeah, I mean, I read your 5 tips on coping with coronavirus in the FT actually, and that was certainly connecting and breathing and exercise and keeping plans short term. What about treats, and does that include a glass of wine?
Definitely. So I think if you do the sort of tasks that you find more challenging, like if you don't like exercise, you give yourself a treat at the end of it. That is really, if you put that in the loop, that makes the whole experience more embedded in your system because you associate it with a treat. So that is very positive. But I think when we're nervous or depressed or whatever difficult feelings we have, if we intentionally do things that soothe and calm us, that has a huge impact. So if you think, you know this, everything that you eat or read or watch or listen to has an effect on your mood. If you choose things that you know soothe you, then you will have a calmer, more peaceful mood. So you may have a playlist that you always turn on when you want to feel calmer, or a playlist that you want to dance to in the kitchen while you're cooking your supper. Or, the two things physical things that help with trauma are dance and yoga. So if you're feeling that you have that kind of in your system, that shock and brittle kind of swirling fear, those two things really help.
Yeah. I had quite an interesting illustration of that over the last couple of days, actually, because a couple of nights ago I kind of did all of that, everything right, had the nice dim lighting in the evening, and a bit of meditation and reading the book. And then yesterday I was back at Sky for the first time in 3 weeks since we've been kind of isolating, because we're still broadcasting there. And it was quite an intense shift. There's not many people in because they're trying to keep it as isolated as possible. And I got back late and I was quite wired when I got back, and there's obviously lots of bright lights. And the difference in my sleep on those 2 nights was really quite marked physically. I kind of felt a bit edgy all the way through the night last night. The night before I slept like a log. So that was quite a nice indication of what you were saying, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a perfect indication of spending a day, at home, and you're kind of going at your own pace, and you can choose what you put into your system and choose, what you engage with, to work where you have to be on, where you have to perform, where you're in this great barn of a building where you cannot not know that there's something terrible happening because there's nobody in it.
Yes.
And then talking and being articulate, is always a bit anxiety provoking. And then traveling back alone, all of that, of course, would wire you, so you wouldn't sleep so well. But it's a perfect example.
Well, what I could have done better is when I got home, rather than reading my book and getting into bed straight away, I spent about an hour on Instagram, which I don't think is part of the your recommendations.
You can get lost on Instagram, can't you?
It's very easy. It's very easy.
It's also not possible to be a blooming saint about these things. You know, so you
No.
do the tips, 4 or 5 of them, and that keeps you on the whole balanced on the straight and narrow. But that doesn't mean that you never do stuff that you know winds you up, whether that's having an extra glass of wine or diving into Instagram and watching something total rubbish on telly. I mean, you know, I think we have to be forgiving as well.
Yeah, definitely.
I think there's much of a sort of curated, my perfect psychological self behaving on a perfectly good, clean-cut day. And I actually think that's too much as well.
Yes, yeah. Well, because then you're not doing the whole letting go thing and accepting and not controlling thing.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then, I mean, obviously you're at the kind of the sharp end of grief counselling, and notice you've been doing this for many years and speaking to many clients. How do you feel we might change long term? And you spoke about the emotional trauma that many of us might feel in coming months and years, but do you think there are any positives that might occur in the way that we relate to ourselves and each other and we deal with grief?
I mean, I'm really interested to see what will happen. I mean, certainly what I see with clients, and whether this happens on a more global scale, I don't know, is something called post-traumatic growth, which is it never denies the level of the loss or the level of the trauma, but through it, people discover aspects of themselves that they never knew they had, so that they are actually more resilient and able to survive what they thought they could never survive, that their perception of what matters completely shifts, and their gratitude for the simple things in life grows much bigger. And that happens very often because they've been so shaken up, and it does change them in a way that feels like growth. Whether that can happen nationally or only individually, I don't know. I think it's very individual. I think some people will desperately want to jump back into exactly what they were doing before, because they'll want to think, this didn't happen, I'm going to put it behind me, I'm going to rush around and be busy and push my career because I'm scared I'm economically damaged now or at risk now. But I think other people will really take a look and think, like, my friends, because we're older than all of you, so we're not so pushy work-wise. We've sort of done a lot of our kind of running uphill. We're all thinking about working in a slightly different way. Yeah.
I mean, I think we are as well. I said, certainly, I'm sure I'm not the only person who said, when this is all over, wouldn't it be nice to live in the country with a few chickens and nice walks?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it would be nice if we let the planet off a bit by traveling less, by recognizing that connection is what really, when people look back on their lives, it's their love and connection to others that matters to them most. I don't think anyone looks back on their life and thinks, wow, I bought a big castle, that makes me so happy. It may do. It may do. But, then you look at what happened after the wars, and there were some great things and there were some really terrible things. So who knows? Who knows?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I do feel just talking about grief and examining it just in this conversation, quite hopeful. And I'm going to initiate a discussion about death with my partner over the next few days.
Good.
Yeah.
And use the word death, not passing over or passing on or passed away.
Okay.
Because you don't pass. I mean, we don't know, but we know you die.
Yeah.
I find all those euphemisms very unhelpful. That sounds a bit brutal, but I suppose I've been in this business 30 years, so it makes me a bit brutal about words sometimes.
Well, we British have euphemisms for everything. My favourite is when you have a dog and you don't tell the dog to do a poo. You say, be clean. Okay, now Julia, what is one book that you would recommend and one tip for living with more energy and vitality?
So that is a very good question. So my book would be William Sieghardt's anthology of poems, which is called the Pharmacy the Poetry Pharmacy. It's a little small red orange book because it has really good poetry for lots of different frames of mind and mood, and then there's funny ones. So I love that, and I keep that by my bed.
Oh, great. That sounds really good. I'll definitely look that up. And what about one tip then for living with energy and vitality?
Loving fully, loving physically, loving in a connected way, daring to love, being loving, receiving love, open to love. That is for me, that's it. And probably having a good night's sleep as a result.
Definitely. And if you don't spend an hour on Instagram before you go to sleep, that helps.
And then not give yourself a hard time if you do.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Julia, thank you so much. It's been really great to talk to you. It's going to be some interesting conversations in my household over the next 24, 48 hours, I think. And where can people find out more about your book and everything that you do? So
I have a website, www.juliasamuel.co.uk. I'm on Instagram, Julia Samuel MBE. And my books, I think probably the best way to get my books now is on Kindle and Audible. Because, I mean, you can order them from Waterstones, but the sort of delivery and all of that is a bit unpredictable right now.
Yeah. So, okay, I'm not following you on Instagram yet, so I'll do it later, but not in the hour before bed. I'll definitely follow you on Instagram. And
ditto.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
And can you actually give me an update of your conversations? I want a conversation with you post your conversations, if you don't mind.
Definitely. Yes. I'll let you know what happens.
Yeah, I want to know what happens.
Super. Julia, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. That is it. Thank you so much to Julia, and thank you for listening to Zestology. Quick reminder, the first Zestology book club will be out in a few days' time, in 3 days' time. So you've got 3 more days to read The Humans by Matt Haig. And if you're looking for a little bit of escapism during these tough times, I highly recommend it. In fact, I'll give you a little sneak preview. Everybody who took part in the book club recording loved it. So that's great. I feel like I've picked a good book, because it's quite hard to pick books that everybody likes. Another quick reminder, this podcast is brought to you by P3OM. And if you want a free bottle of this patented probiotic, you can head to p3om.com/zestologyfree. Perfect for the month of May and for these tough times that we're going through at the moment when you want to boost your immune system. It all starts in the gut. So if you head to p3om.com/zestologyfree, you can claim your free probiotic. That is pretty much it for this podcast. Thanks for listening all the way through to the end. You might well be able to hear my darling son screaming in the background. That is just the kind of thing you get during lockdown, isn't it? There's just no escape. But hey, you know what? I mean, normally he's quite happy, but he's finding it tough sometimes, like all of us. And remember, this too shall pass. I hope to see you in the book club in 3 days' time. If you haven't finished the book, or gone all the way through the book, I think you still enjoy the podcast because we broadened it out to talk more about books in general. That's coming out on Thursday. Until then, give your free bottle of P3OM a go and have a great week.